Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and welcome to those of you who are with us for the first time. Thank you so much for joining us for the Frontline Club's monthly book night, Fran Smith's brilliant and very special idea. Because with this book club, you can meet the author, and it's a book club that's not dependent on talking about newly published books, but also ones we've been wanting to read for some time, or those we have read and love so much that we'd like to share. Our authors have included Louis de Bernier, Adib Shafak, Kegi Carew, Amanda Craig, John Simpson, and Philippe Sands. And tonight we're going to chat with one of my very own authors, Michael Vatikiotis, about his latest book, Lives Between the Lines, A Journey in Search of the Lost Levant, which begins with the parting of the sands, the construction of the Suez Canal that united the Mediterranean Arabian seas and opened the door for opportunity for people living insecurely on the fringes of a turbulent Europe. It tells the story of Michael's Greek, British, and Italian family who arrived in Egypt and Palestine in the mid-19th century as migrants armed with talents and skills that were much in demand as Ottoman rulers sought to modernize their lands. They worked for the post office and the railways, but also included charismatic monks and successful entrepreneurs who built things and left their mark on society. A family history and memoir, and a bit of a departure from Michael's previous books, which have focused on Southeast Asia, where he has lived and worked for over 30 years as a journalist, first with Outlook for the BBC, and then as the editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, whose loss is still lamented. His official title now is Director Asia, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, headquartered in Geneva. So you'll understand that Asia, from the Bosphorus to North Japan, is a rather large territory to cover, which means that Michael is constantly on call, but it also means he is so very well connected. It is his business to be, and he is famous. I can hardly sit down with him in a restaurant, cafe, bar, when I'm out there myself in Asia, without someone approaching him deferentially. Michael, who has an undergraduate degree from SOAS, where his father, PJ, was an eminent professor of the Middle East, and who has a doctorate from Oxford, is multilingual. He speaks Indonesian, Thai, French, Italian, English, and a smattering of Greek and Arabic. Have I left out any others? And his last book, Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia, drew high praise and continues to sell and sell. As Gideon Rackman from the FT has written in his review, books on Asia tend to concentrate on China and India. Vatikiotis fills a gap by providing a lively and learned guide to the politics, personalities, and conflicts that are shaping a dynamic group of countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Burma. Salil Tripathi in the South China Morning Post writes that Vatikiotis offers a lucid portrait of this fascinating region by bringing together a student's sense of wonder and curiosity, a journalist's skepticism and diligence in making sense of reality, and a peacemaker's compassion for the vulnerable. A review, I think, that could also be applied to Lives Between the Lines. Michael, thank you for joining us. We're so delighted that you've been able to make it here to the UK from Singapore for the event tonight. And as usual, we'll have a few questions back and forth, have a very kind of wide-ranging, very relaxed chat. But I want to feed in also from the audience. Please tell me, your questions, because I'd like to present those to Michael as well. And you'll see tonight we have a little different format where we're sitting side by side, a sort of hybrid-esque event. So I'm going to open with my first question from this new book. Why the departure from Southeast Asia, which everyone knows to be your area of expertise?
It was a question that I asked myself. Why would I ever leave a part of the world that I know very well to write about a part of the world that I don't live in? And that I have to say, I don't know as well, as parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia. But I guess that all was wrapped up in what drove me to write the book, which was essentially the quest for my origins, for understanding where my family came from, and I suppose to some extent where I came from. I was born in the United States, I grew up in England, but there was always in the background the sense of origin in the Middle East. And as a student and also as a journalist early on in my career, I traveled And I always felt a passion for the place. And I always used to say, as a student of Southeast Asia, that because I wasn't looking at the Middle East and I wasn't studying the Middle East, I could look at Southeast Asia with more dispassion, you know. Whereas with the Middle East, I was always driven to this emotional response to the conflicts there, to what had happened. And so it was with some trepidation that I actually sort of said, well, I'm actually going to write about where my family came from in the Middle East. And it's a very emotional thing. You know, when I analyze and look at other parts of Asia, it's not such a connection for me, other than the fact that I lived there for almost 4 decades. But the Middle East is family. And so I was fearful and cautious about approaching it.
So I've described this book as a family history when I talk to people about it, as a family history, a memoir. But you know, really, it's more than that. It's also the story of a journey, both physically and over time, and in many ways, it sort of defies a succinct definition. This book. What would you say? I mean, how would you describe? How, when you talk about this book to other people, how do you describe it?
I think in the end, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of family, but there's also a journey, and there's also me. And I think in the end, that's probably what I consider to be more important, is that it's a journey in search of a lost era that my family grew up in, and where they came from. And I was in search of it. And it was much easier to approach this as a journey than to approach it as a sort of historical framework. Although there is a historical framework, 1859 to 1956, the start of the construction of the Suez Canal and the Suez Crisis. But the journey was very important, and in many ways I regret that I didn't put more of the journey, or there wasn't more of the journey to put in, because that was a very important part of that's the spine of the book, essentially.
Well, our publisher said, we're talking about the narrative arc of this book, how we're going to structure the narrative, and our lovely publisher, Alan Sampson, combined with Alan Nicholson, said to you in a sort of planning session, start with the Suez, end with the Suez. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was a very useful piece of advice. Always listen to the publisher.
So especially if it's Alan Sampson. So one thing that has inspired this book, as we were just saying, is this hodgepodge of your DNA. Yes, I mean, I think you and I we're alike in that aspect, that respect. We've talked about this before. I've always been a little bit envious of people like, you know, my husband who know exactly where they come from. You know, in his case, Scotland, the line is clear. I mean, he doesn't say I'm Scottish, but he knows his family are from Scotland. And as an American with a hodgepodge immigrant family history myself, and as an American immigrant to the UK, I've spent hours and too much money on ancestry.com searching for where we came from. And I wonder why does this matter? Does it?
Well, the context was also very important for me, because everyone has family histories. But what I thought would make a very interesting and engaging story was the fact that my family history was in a part of the world where there was a lost era as well. I mean, not just, you know, that they had to leave, but the whole era that they lived in was disappeared. And that for me was very important to sort of make it a more interesting story. Everyone has family stories, and people have more interesting family stories than I have. But for me, it was also the fact that my family were Europeans who left Europe as refugees and arrived in the Middle East as a place of refuge, where they did well and prospered. And then 100 years later, left as refugees back to Europe, where they had come from. And I thought this is a very engaging story, particularly because of what's going on today with tens of thousands of refugees coming from the Middle East to Europe.
I mean, it is. I mean, there's this saying in publishing where everybody has a good book in them, but you know, some of them. So everybody has a book in them, but some of them should keep it inside. And a lot of, you know, what makes a good book is the way the story is told. And you know, you have, you know, your background as a journalist, and also you've written novels and short stories. I think that you have this, you know, real gift of telling a story that, you know, could otherwise be, you know, as you say, there are other people with maybe more interesting stories. It's the way that you tell it in particular. I love the way that, you know, you set the scene and create and convey the characters that you meet along the way, and you understand from the past. And we'll get to that a bit later. But I mean, I want to talk a little bit more about your hodgepodge bits of DNA. And I want you to read, if you don't mind, from the book. There's a little passage here.
Yes, I'm very fond of this passage. It was written with great passion. Inside I'm really a Canaanite, a hodgepodge of bits of DNA flung around desert caravanserai, mingled with that of weary Iberian Sephardic outcasts and wild Ottoman janissaries scything their way through the Balkans. I grew up bereft of the Oriental moorings that my Middle Eastern antecedents clung to. I'm neither a proper Jew nor an observant Eastern Christian. People I know well smell the whiff of the Levant about me, a chronically malleable stance on everything, the way I assess the context of any question before giving an answer. These are classic Levantine characteristics. Outcomes invariably depend on circumstances for the Levantine. We never bet on a single option. We act the insider where we're really outsiders.
I would say that your background or your genetics as a Levantine, do you think that it does inform your work as a peace negotiator?
I think it's informed my whole approach to life, which is, and my father was the same, which is, never to quite, as I said, take a decision before weighing up all the options, and not to be too definite about anything, because it depends on circumstances, especially when you're from a very mixed background. And I think, there was Eric Ambler wrote this famous novel, what wasn't so famous, but it's a good novel, called The Levant, where he describes the Levantines as sort of shifty, untrustworthy people. Because in a way, that's kind of how they survived. Always fitting in, but never quite belonging. And I think it's important to say that this society wasn't about assimilation and integration. And for me, I've learned a great deal about some of the modern challenges today by thinking about that, because this desire to integrate, this desire to assimilate, to belong, it's all wrong. Why can't we just float? Why can't we just half belong, fit in? It's something that I was very much drawn to, given all the conflict we see today about identity.
And this was allowed, mixing but not mingling, or mingling but not mixing under the Ottoman Empire, right? They kind of facilitated that and allowed people to thrive. The three monotheistic religions lived and thrived in harmony during this golden period. It
was an essential component of stability in the Ottoman Empire, that you simply had to allow people to follow their own religion and be allowed to do so, to follow their trades and be allowed to do so. And the way that the Ottomans dealt with this is that you simply govern yourselves, because they didn't have a sort of the spatial notion of empire. It was all different communities, the so-called millet system. They governed themselves. As long as they weren't in trouble, they left you alone, and as long as you paid the tax.
So yeah, I love that. I learned so much with all the non-fiction books that I edit and that I have edited and that I represent, and I've learned so much about the Middle East and the millet system and the Ottoman Empire during this period. It's just a fascinating read. That last quote that you put in was from the last two chapters of the book, and Richard Spencer, writing in the Times in his review, says that the last two chapters are worth the cover price alone. So getting back to the sort of hodgepodge background of yours, you describe yourself as part Jew, part Italian. I describe you to people like this. So he's part Jew, part Italian, Greek, and obviously with a surname like Vatikiotis, part Catholic, part British. Do you think that in all cultural appropriation is such a it's in the news constantly now, but do you think this multicultural, cosmopolitan perhaps background gives you license, or perhaps a broader license, to write about these other cultures, or indeed any other culture, given that they are a part of you, even if sort of peripherally? And you did, after all, grow up in a household where your father, the great scholar of the Middle East, Vatikiotis, author of books including Amongst Arabs and Jews, Modern History of Egypt, and a biography of Nasser, also published by Weidenfeld Nicholson, as you are, would tell you stories of the old world, quote unquote, around the dining table, where you could hear at home, where you would hear at home, a babble of languages on the radio, on the phone, but presumably where your Welsh mother would have served up a traditional Sunday roast. What was it like going to school here in this country amongst the English?
Well, I dwell on this at length in the book at several points about the fact that growing up in England had it imposed a sort of monotonal, it imposed a sort of sense of suppressing identity, because at the time that I came here in the 1960s, and then throughout the 70s, it wasn't really hip to be foreign. It wasn't cool to be diverse. And when you were sent to English private schools, you really had to fit into English culture. And there's so much about that culture. It's about suppression of many things, including identity. And that was something that, again, I think drove me to sort of explore where I came from, because I had had so much of that. And I'd worked for the BBC after I went to two very good universities. And so beyond school, there were these English institutions that sort of continued to suppress identity, and even up until including the BBC, very establishment. And it was only really when I got to Asia that I thought, well, actually, I'm quite a diverse person, and I have all these different identities. And of course, Asia, I think, handles this a little bit better. I mean, there's a lot of ethnic violence and prejudice throughout Asian history. But actually, on the whole question of diversity, I mean, the society depends on that. It depends on a sort of an arrangement to accommodate diversity, not to suppress it. And so I think that's what helped me sort of begin to understand a bit more where I came from and why it was important to sort of, at least for me, to trace the history.
And do you think that, getting back to one of my earlier questions in this one on 4, I mean, do you think that this gives you a license to write about these other cultures, or broader kind of, do you feel more relaxed? I mean, in this age where you're not allowed to, you're the kind of culture police are saying you can't write about this society or that society or this culture or that culture because you're not. I mean, you are. So much of you is about other cultures. So,
well, I'm fortunate that I don't live here in the UK or in the United States, where of course these currents are very currently very apparent. I live in a part of the world that kind of thing is not. So I wasn't encumbered by it. And I don't need a license to write about anything. Who said that you need a license to write? I've written novels entirely set in Indonesia with Indonesian characters. So I feel that perhaps having been in Asia to write, sitting there and writing this book, I just felt a bit more liberated.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of Asia is that people are much more open about, their own identity, your identity. They tell you like it is. I remember, like the people will say, "Oh, you've got a spot," or "You look fat," or you look too pale, or you look too tan. And I really enjoy that kind of really openness and honesty about it. And as you say, every region has its flaws, but still, I really enjoy that as an American myself. I want to talk to you, Chris Gunness, who's ex-BBC, in his interview with you for the Royal Society of Asian Affairs, mentioned this quote. You say, "My mother described the society she grew up in before the Second World War in Cairo as a practiced style of interdependence. One felt," she said, "at ease and comfortable with the many languages spoken, the many faiths practiced and tolerated. The threat to this loose yet effective form of pluralism came in the form of European imperial adventurers. The seeds were sown in the late 19th century with the loss of Ottoman lands, aided by the European powers." Do you expand on this for me?
Well, I mean, it's my, throughout the book, and as I was sort of approaching this subject, I knew a very big part of this was a number of these stories of imperial intrusion and how that massively affected, and the Middle East was massively affected by the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which was essentially accelerated by European intervention, and then its replacement with, reflecting the title, a lot of partition, a lot of lines that were drawn in the sand in the region, more or less artificially dividing the region according to European imperial design. And so naturally, my concern, looking at my family history, was the way in which this essentially ended the era of cosmopolitanism, ended that era of Ottoman sort of easy tolerance, and replaced it with a partitioned, segregated, unassimilated, dividing people into groups who were said, one of my favorite examples is the city of Jerusalem, which before its occupation by the British in 1917 did not consist of different religious quarters. I mean, everyone kind of mingled. Yeah, you had the churches and the mosques and good places, but there was no formal quartering of the city until General Allenby arrived in 1917. And said, well, of course, the Muslims should have their own quarter, and the Christians should have their own quarter, and the Jews should have their own quarter. It was this obsession, this imperial obsession with partition, that I think has generally been a bad thing in the Middle East, but also in other parts, not to mention India.
Yeah, so one of the next question, interesting point. Yes, I would agree entirely. We've got somebody here who's helping us, Preeti, and it's quite interesting that we're having this discussion in front of Preeti because she's a young woman here who's part of this common conversation now about culture, identity, and multiculturalism. And I wonder, we'll talk to you later about what you think of what we're talking about here. So one of the key themes of this book is the fact of migration, going, which you touched on earlier, in the opposite direction to what it is now. You've said the period spanning a century from 1850 to 1950 saw the Middle East traverse a remarkable arc of growth and prosperity that fostered diversity and creativity, blending the energy and aspiration of Occidental immigrants with the refined manners and tolerant culture of the Orient, in a brief, effervescent moment of economic and social progress, in stark contrast to the image of the Middle East today, sadly, from which tens of thousands of people flee each year, seeking asylum in Europe. The Middle East then was a haven for tens of thousands of Europeans fleeing war and poverty. I mean, I think so many people, I had no idea, but so many people today don't know about this, this reverse migration or migration, to the east. Well, where there were places like Cairo were full of economic migrants, and what are your thoughts on this now? Perhaps in light of what's happening in Syria and in Afghanistan and Israel and Palestine, and this sort of narrative about the anti-migration narrative.
Well, it's even more interesting than that, because if you go back to that period where poor Italians and Greeks were leaving in droves, either escaping a feudal system as they did in Italy, or just complete sort of economic despair. In the period of sort of revolutionary nation building, there was war, there was uprising, and then when the states emerged, they were very poor, so there was nothing to do. My Greek ancestors were very much involved in the Greek Revolution, to win independence from the Ottomans, and my great grandfather simply turned around at the end of the revolution and went to work for the Ottomans by migrating to Palestine, because there was simply no work. There was nothing to do in the new, kingdom of Greece. But if you look at it also through the lens, most people, when they think about migration in this period, they think about poor Italians going to the United States. And the New World was the mecca, if you like, of migrants. But in fact, what happened to many of the Italians in America is they were treated so badly. The Italians were treated as colors. They were literally had to sit in different seats because they were colored. They were from the south of Italy, and they were poor and they were treated very badly. But the Italians who went to Egypt, my mother's family, they were treated very well. They were artisans. They were better off. They were merchants. They were from a different class in a way. The Italians who went to America were peasants escaping the feudal system. The Italians who went to Egypt and North Africa, were essentially the artists, the architects, the painters, the doctors, the lawyers, who were brought over by the Egyptians to essentially modernize the country, and they did very well. And they were given, protection from the law, from Egyptian law. They were given privileged professions. My great grandfather ran the post office in Egypt. And I think there's a sort of slightly different form of migration, but they were nonetheless escaping instability, insecurity, and they found stability and prosperity in the Middle East.
Yeah, tell me about some of the Sornagas.
Well, they were Italian Jews from Livorno, or Leghorn, as it's called in English, which is a Tuscan town on the coast of Italy, that was actually, together with Amsterdam, one of the main centers of Jewish settlement in the Middle Ages. And the Tuscans were very progressive even back then, and they didn't necessarily force the Jews into ghettos, and they realized that, we could use them to do business. And so Livorno became a very big commercial center for the Jews, and they already had connections in the Middle East. And there was a lot of trade going back and forth. The British Levant company was based in Leghorn. And so they went down further south to Rome at the time of the revolution, the uprising, the Risorgimento, as it's called in Italy, when the formation of the United Kingdom of Italy, because Garibaldi, who led that struggle, realized the Jews could be useful. The Jews could be very useful because they were prejudiced and persecuted, and if they were somehow brought on board with the Italian project, they would be supported, which they were. Then they were disappointed. They were obviously very nervous about the Pope, very nervous about what was going on in Italy. Many of them left before the revolution ended. So that they were nationalists, and they were. This is the other thing, that when you get to the Middle East and you see these communities, Greeks, Italians, whether they were Jews or Christians, they remained very, very nationalistic. They didn't integrate or assimilate. Many of them were, of course, Italian or Greek citizens, but they nonetheless benefited from being there, and they were treated very well.
Well, okay. So many questions. So, which direction do I want to go in? So, they remained Italian when they were there. I mean, tell us about when your father and your mother returned to this country after having been in Egypt, and they came. Well, they came here, or they would remind me, America first or here first.
So I think this is the other. I didn't label this in the book. What I'm discovering more and more is that, of course, the trauma of leaving the Middle East made it very difficult for them to settle and to fit in. Despite being Italian, my mother Italian with an English father, English passport, my father, becoming a naturalized American, they just didn't fit in. It wasn't there, and they had had such a good life in the Middle East, and the family environment being so, secure.
Sunny
and privileged, to be honest. I mean, they were privileged. And I think that, going to the US and going to England, even though that was the place after the war where things were happening, they just didn't fit in. It wasn't easy. They had passports and they had identity, but they weren't of the place. My grandfather, my Greek grandfather, arrived in Greece in 1954, having been forced to leave Palestine, then Israel. And he said, I'm a refugee. He was a refugee in the country of his origin.
So your parents met in Cairo, yes. And then your father went off to the States and he married somebody else, had a brief marriage. And then your mother and he kind of eventually restarted they were pen pals for a while after that marriage faltered rather quickly. He's like, oh, I made a huge mistake, come back to me. And your father, speaking of somebody kind of a man, kind of made good, or in making his own way, he was in the US military.
He was inducted, as they said in those days, into the US military.
What did he do for that?
He was a private first class specialist in a transport company.
And where was
he? He was a clerk.
Okay.
In Germany.
Okay, it's in Germany. And that's where your parents got married.
They got married in Heidelberg, yeah. And again, the 50s in Europe it must have been extremely discombobulating, because not only did they come from the Middle East, but they were in a part of the world that they knew about and belonged to some extent, but were new and rather, I suppose, disconcertingly insecure. Yeah. So yes, and they eventually settled in England. I mean, in the US and then in England.
I'm trying to feed in some questions, so please ask questions. Panvera, I'm not, if you're watching, I'm not really seeing any questions feed through, so if you can let me know, maybe text me what's going on. Oh, I see there's a question now that came up on your computer, please, but I'm not on mine, strangely. Panvera, can you just text me what these questions say, and I can feed them in that way. So one of the things, speaking of Cairo, one of the things, and the different places you talk about, one of the things I love about this book, and which I encourage, was your novelistic ability to evoke a sense of place. You really have the ability to transport us to another time, another place, and maybe your novels have helped. Your work as a novelist have helped you refine this. But just to allow our audience a glimpse of what I mean, Could you read the last paragraph, page 65? I know I'm kind of springing this on you. Do you need glasses or something?
No, I had wearing.
Reading glasses. Okay, I was thinking about this morning. So I love your sense of place, and also Michael has a great sense of humor. It's not really coming across right now in this sort of rather serious discussion, but you have a great. There's the last paragraph, page 65, and this is kind of this is how Michael will set the scene for us.
So this is me in Cairo, having been to see. Trying to find the graves of my family in Cairo. It was a rather depressing day. Couldn't find the Jewish cemetery. I ended up finding a sort of a couple of ossuaries where the members of the family had been deposited, and the cemeteries are so overcrowded they kind of bring everyone together and shove them in one box. It was really rather sort of depressing. So I'm standing on the balcony in my friend's apartment where I was staying. And saying later that evening, on the balcony in Zamalek, overlooking the Nile, I allowed myself to be mesmerized by the great river. Garish purple and yellow lights on the side of passing restaurant boats danced on the rippling dark water, which drifted along like some giant electronic water beetle. In the distance, the call to evening prayer competed with the honking cacophony of evening traffic across the 16th of July bridge. The press of humanity below gave off a musty smell of dust, sweat, and onions. Omar's anger and frustration with his people struck in a rut of perpetual underachievement, living in shabby, half-built, illegal structures that could be destroyed without warning, brought into sharp relief the contrast with my Italian family's transition from Jews of the ghetto to pillars of the professional class. For the Sornagas, Egypt was at first a life raft and then a bountiful cornucopia. They enjoyed the privileges of education, wealth, and connection, as well as protection under the capitulations. The contrast troubled me. With a few taps on my phone, I started playing the famous Grand March from Aida.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Aida. You went to the opera house in Cairo, didn't you? And did you to see a production of Aida?
Well, I'm not an opera goer or an opera lover, but the 1871 performance of Aida was in many ways the coming out party for the Egypt of that period, which was 3 years after the completion of the Suez Canal. My mother's family's already made it. To some extent, cotton ginning industry, they're members of society. And there was this amazing event that took place at the newly built Cairo Opera House, where Giuseppe Verdi was commissioned to write this opera, Aida, which is set in Egypt. And everyone thinks that it was sort of commissioned for the opening of the Suez Canal, but in fact, it was commissioned for the opening of the Opera House, which was Khedive Ismail's other great project. And so I tried to recreate the opening night of Aida in 1871. It was like the 1st or 2nd of December, 1871, or certainly in December. So it was late in the year, it would have been quite cool. And everyone was there. Everyone who was anybody in Egypt went to that performance, including members of my family. And so I pieced together from different descriptions, somewhat, as I said, I'm not an opera expert, but it was just such an evocative period. So anyway, much later on in one of my journeys to Egypt, I noticed that there was a performance of Aida at the new opera house, a rather sort of awful place that the Japanese built. And I went along to this, and it was fascinating because, of course, Aida, the opera, is the same, but the audience was just not the same. And it was, and it was just this contrast in eras that was so interesting for me.
I mean, God, I remember when I was growing up, getting on a plane was such a big event, and you would get dressed up, and you wear your nice clothes, and etc. And it was a real, it's a special thing. And then as travel became more common, then you could go into a plane on your flip flops, which people do now. I suppose the same as could be said of the opera, and I suppose it's a good thing.
People don't dress up for the opera.
Yeah. They don't dress up for church either. I don't go to church anymore, but I remember my dad complaining once to the priest and said, "Oh, God, I grew up in Florida, so it was hot, and he said, "Oh, but they're coming to church in flip-flops," and the priest said, "Well, at least they're coming," right?
Yeah.
So, Michael, you lead, such a, which I've said before in the press release, you lead a fascinating, character-filled life, and I always look forward to your tales of far-flung places. And I filter through your acutely observed diplomatic sensibility and sense of humour. Your cosmopolitan family background adds a uniquely nuanced sense of depth to your ability to read people and understand them in the context of their own circumstances. How has your work as a peace negotiator informed the writing of this book? Were you conscious of this having an impact?
Well, when you talk about the Middle East, the next thing that comes along is, of course, the peace process, or the absence of any success of the peace process in the Middle East that has essentially driven the conflict for the last 70 years between Arab and Jew. And any time spent in Jerusalem, Israel, is a constant reminder of the failure of that process. And I remember when I first joined the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue as a young, mid-career change from journalism to mediation. And I said to my boss, "Well, why aren't we doing anything about Palestinians and the Jews and the Israelis?" They said, "Well, no one's ever going to solve that one, so we'll just leave that alone." So here was this new private organization that set itself out to be sort of private diplomats to the world, and we were just not going to touch it because it's just too difficult. And no one's ever going to resolve it. I mean, and I carried that with me for the last 15 years, thinking, well, wait a minute, surely there is a way. And I suppose in the book, I've sort of drawn, not a conclusion, but in the journey, I basically took the view that, well, actually, maybe there is no two-state solution. Maybe it is a one-state solution. And maybe it is about Arabs and Jews finally being able to live together under one roof. And that's a very controversial thing. I mean, it's what essentially drove the last election. That's why the Arab parties are in the government. They are a significant proportion of the electorate. And I suppose many people are moving in that direction, but it's not an easy debate to have.
I'm just looking at the screen because I want to make sure you're on screen for a while you're leaning back. So speaking of the peace process, tell me a little bit about your dad and his involvement and his ideas on this.
Well, my father was an academic. He was originally a student of Islamic history, and his PhD thesis was on the Fatimids. It's actually published in Pakistan in the 1950s.
He was born where?
He was born in Jerusalem. And he became a political scientist, and he taught what they call in the US university system at the time, government, political science. And over the years, of course, he wrote about the Middle East conflict. He wrote about Egypt, Jordan, and he sort of danced around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I discovered in the course of writing the book, there was a good reason for that, because he was very close. He went to school with the founding members of the Palestinian Liberation Movement, and they were his friends. And he had a great passion for them and what they were doing. But of course, he didn't want to write about it. He was very careful not to write about his friends. In fact, I found out that he wrote about this in short stories that were never published. Fiction, allegedly fiction, thinly veiled fiction. But later in life, he did get drawn into, if you like, the peace business. And he did try, and I discovered recently in papers that I hadn't seen before, that there's this Vatikiotis plan for peace in the Middle East. I thought, God, all due modesty. But he was drawn into this, I think, by a sense of the idea that there is a link between the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean is closely linked with the Middle East through history, and that ultimately a solution would have to be born out of the Greeks and the Italians in particular, helping the Arabs and the Israelis to reach an accommodation. And so he did a series of conferences, and got George Weidenfeld involved, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, Crown Prince Hassan from Jordan. He tried to pull together a group of people to think about an Oriental solution. I put it that way because that's what he meant. It's, the Greeks would get very frustrated with him as a Greek because he'd say, "You're Orientals. You're not Europeans. You're Orientals. Your history is with the Middle East, not with Europe," which is true. 450 years of Ottoman rule. So, I mean, it was difficult because not many people bought into that argument. And the great powers, the Western powers, have always tried to conduct this negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis in a vacuum, without looking at the context, in the European and Mediterranean context. And I think he had the right idea. It was just, he died too young.
So he died when he was
69.
So do you think that maybe subconsciously writing this book as a way of sort of finding your father again, getting closer to him? Did you ever think about that, or getting, trying to understand who he was, of all the people that you write about?
Unconsciously, yes. And I think it was Richard Spencer in his review in the Times who said it was a homage to my father, and in a way it was. But what I tried to do in the book also is elevate because when we were growing up, it was all about my father's family. But I tried to elevate the significance of my mother's Italian family, and not to mention my single English relative, my sort of Welsh grandfather, who played a sort of a minor part in the British Empire in Transjordan in 1925, in 1922 to 25, where he worked alongside Philby and Lawrence, Gertrude Bell. And he very famously in our family didn't say very much, but he did write a 15-page memo about this experience, which is very interesting in terms of its observation. I mean, clearly, what's interesting is that in the 1920s, there were Englishmen or English people who saw the ridiculousness of the British Empire's position in the Middle East. We made these contradictory promises. We promised the Jews a homeland, and then we promised the Arabs kingdoms. This is not going to work. He wrote this, at the time. He said, this is nonsense. I think many people were worried about this contradiction as sowing the seeds of conflict, which indeed they did.
So I'm going to correct you, because the first time I came over to this country 26 years ago on a plane, I was just, FOB, green as grass, and I said to this chap next to me on the plane, "Are you English?" And he said, "I'm not English, I'm Welsh." "How dare you?" He said, "The English are the worst, the Welsh are the friendliest, and then the Cornish and then the Scots and blah blah blah." So I mean, for all the Welsh people out there. But so your father and his involvement with the Palestinians. I mean, this was a discovery for you? How close? It
was a discovery. It was a discovery, for instance, that when I was 2 years old, my father took me to Beirut to show me off, to the founding members of the PFLP, the Palestinian Front Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who later conducted these violent hijackings. But they were school friends. And so he said, "Oh, here's my baby son." I mean, for him, it was like, this is what you do. You show off your son to your mates. And I think later he became very disillusioned with that because they chose the path of almost senseless violence. I think, it would have been, for my father, it would have been better if they'd sort of gone to the West Bank and fought, mano a mano with the Israelis. But this sort of moving into the hijacking and the if you like, the taking of hostages and the sort of the collateral damage that created. I think he was very upset by that. He wanted them to have a real struggle. He wanted them to do it properly on the ground, which they could never sort of end up doing. I mean, part of the long tragedy of the Palestinian conflict is, of course, that the Israelis were just very good at fighting these wars. The Arabs were not very good at supporting the Palestinians, but they knew that they could never defeat the Israelis. And I think that was for my father, the bottom line is that, no, they're never going to come together. This is not going to work. And, that's it. Israel has no interest in finding a settlement.
So speaking now about your mother, tell me a little bit about the Sonaga factory. And actually, I have a little something to give to you, not right now, but it's in America that I found on eBay from the Sonaga factory. But tell us a little bit about this. I mean, talking about the other side of your family, your mother's side, and Al-Wadi or
El-Wadi. So the Jewish Sonagas, they arrived. They got into the cotton business, which was, of course, Egypt's great export in the mid-19th century, mainly because of the American Civil War. When the British, when the North blockaded the South, the cotton exports from the South of the United States dried up, and therefore cotton took off in Egypt. And my family originally went to the cotton. And then my great uncle wanted to escape the cotton business and decided to go into ceramics, brick making, tile making. He chose a place along the Nile, south of Levant, and started a very profitable business that became a very well-known company, Sornaga Ceramics. And the factory is still there. The villa that he built is still there. It's been turned into a hotel resort now. It was an extremely successful business. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce. He was a member of the Economic Council of Egypt. It was a blue chip company, if you like. I don't think it went public, but it was certainly a well-known company.
I'm off screen because basically I've got the questions here from some of the audience. We've got Nasser Kalawood. Please forgive my pronunciation, but he says Nasser Kalawood, London. Later, and I cannot help but compare your new book with your father's book, Among Arabs and Jews. Eager to do it as I did as he was my professor, PJ Vatikiotis. I knew him as a SOA student in 1985 to 6, then as a warm friend from my interview with him, splashed in Al Hayat newspaper, 1996 till his death. I felt his pains as what to do with his library due to my son specializing in Southeast Asia. Interesting, right? Oh my God, I'm going to cry. Yeah. Also, I attended his memorial in the Hellenic Centre in London, along with your mother and sister. In short, I'm very happy to compare between father and son, since I have had many tips from him in our long phone calls.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that Among Arabs and Jews, because in the book I say that this is very much the seed of my book, because it's a fantastic little book, but it is so small. It is so modest. I mean, he set out with a great title, Among Arabs and Jews, to talk about his upbringing in the Middle East. But actually, half the book is about complaining about the British education system. He got so angry towards the end of his career, and so in a way, it's sort of slightly truncated. And for me, the beginning of this book, the one that I've written, was just how little I felt I got out of Among Arabs and Jews, although it was a very important seed. And being an academic, it wasn't really a work of journalism, and it wasn't really a journey. It was just he was making his recollections. And so I think actually the two should be read together. But the disappointment for me in Among Arabs and Jews is that it was too short. There was too little of it.
Well, I think we'll get to that. I mean, I think that's what Richard Spencer said about, I'll say, this is what Richard Spencer said about lives between the lines. And he said, I wanted more, you want more, I wanted more, which is what I think a great thing about the book. It leaves you wanting more. You get enough and you're kind of inspired to kind of journey on to yourself. Oh, sorry. Okay, so Mike Skylon. Shalom. Forgive me. So he says, hi, Michael. Congratulations on the book. It's an excellent read. Yay. Well, that's me. You're saying yay. One description early on when you arrive in Cairo was very startling. The beggar's anger, and also Omar, the taxi driver's anger. I've not been to Egypt, so I don't know, but from my own travels in India, that quality of pure anger was not the norm. And I wonder why the Egyptian beggar is so angry in your view, please. Do they feel abandoned by the state, or is it the heat or religious differences, or is poverty in Egypt somehow different than it is in India, or all of the above? Best wishes, Mike.
Well, thank you, Mike. And we went to school together. Actually, our fathers knew each other. Mike's father's from Egypt as well. No, I mean, the anger in Egypt, both I described the beggars, but also the driver that I had took me around. I mean, there is sheer frustration. I mean, everyone knows about the Arab Spring in 2011, which failed essentially. You have a society that's already very conservative, and so young men, can't afford to get married. They have no outlets. They have no the professional. Millions of Egyptians now work outside of Egypt because there are no jobs in Egypt. The regime is awful. And there's tremendous pent-up frustration. I mean, sexual frustration, mental frustration, and the aggravation of a very crowded system, one of the most crowded and polluted cities in the world. And so when you add all those things up, the slightest, like I described in the book, the slightest thing becomes an argument. That they just get set off very easily because everything is just pent up and there's no outlet. And it's the striking thing about Egyptian youth, and even middle class and the upper classes, they're just so angry because there doesn't seem to be any hope.
I want to talk to you just quickly. We're running a little bit out of time. We might cut it a little bit short because we are having one of the first ever post-COVID live in-person launch parties next door in the club. But I want to tell you, tell the audience about the generation of the title, because we went through a few kind of options, didn't we? I mean, I think people who aren't writers like to know how it was going to be dust and lemons and referencing Durrell, and what other options did we have? Can you remember?
Well, I mean, we started with something evocative, dust and lemons. And my boss, in fact, said it should be called Dust. In the name of the last book. So,
right.
But in the end, Lives Between the Lines for me was such the type of use because of the whole issue of partition. The blight on the Middle East. At the end of the Ottoman Empire, where there were no lines, there were no boundaries. Essentially, there were communal boundaries. There were social boundaries, religious boundaries, but there were no physical lines. There were no boundaries in that sense. And then that was all imposed by the Europeans, and that's essentially, what helped generate generations of conflict, 2 generations of conflict, at least. And so I felt that Lives Between the Lines, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, the partition of the city of Jerusalem, the partition of the Middle East. It was a good way of describing my family's life between the Ottoman Empire, the imperial, the British imperial era, and then the modern era, the beginning of the modern era.
I think we'll wrap it up with that. But look, here's this beautiful cover, Lives Between the Lines, available in all good bookshops now around
As well.
Around the world in English and soon to be in translation, but also on Amazon. And so please, Michael, thank you so much. I was so looking forward to this. This book has been, a dream come true for me to agent, and we've been thinking about it for so very long. And Michael was one of my first authors with the agency, and I feel so privileged to be sitting here next to you now. And so thank you, Preeti, for helping us with all the kind of IT stuff. Thank you, Pranvera, for allowing me to have Michael here. Thank you to the audience for sitting on Zoom with us, and we can't wait to have you in person, live or hybrid. And thank you to the Frontline Club. Our next book will be on, I think, 21st of September. Pranvera, you might have to put it up, or the Frontline Club can put it up. It will be with Christina Lamb to discuss Our Bodies, Their Battles, which will be, very interesting discussion. It's a very difficult book to read and quite relevant considering what's going on now in the world. But anyway, thank you. Have a great evening and let's party, right? Cheers.
Thank you.